Imagine the skies in 1941, where lumbering Soviet bombers carried a top-secret weapon that seemed plucked from the pages of science fiction, flying aircraft carriers. These airborne juggernauts weren't just planes. They were mobile airbases, capable of launching swarms of fighters deep into enemy territory. Designed to rewrite the rules of war, they were as daring as they were ingenious. But were these flying marvels a stroke of brilliance or just a desperate gamble into the heat of battle? Let's uncover their incredible story. By the 1930s, it was clear that aircraft would dominate future conflicts. Bombers with their long-range capabilities could strike deep into enemy territory. But there was a catch. Their fighter escorts couldn't keep up. Fighter planes were built for speed and agility, not endurance, leaving bombers vulnerable once they crossed into hostile airspace. But there was a catch. Their fighter escorts couldn't keep up. Armed with a few machine guns, bombers stood little chance against enemy fighters, suffering devastating losses. Soviet engineer Vladimir Vakhmistrov saw an opportunity to solve this mismatch. His idea was deceptively simple. Let bombers carry the fighters. This would give the fighters a ride over long distances, ensuring bombers had protection when they needed it most. It was a radical concept, but could it work? Vladimir Vakhmistrov wasn't your average Soviet engineer. He was a visionary willing to challenge the limits of 1930s aviation. Faced with the problem of vulnerable bombers, he proposed a daring idea: flying aircraft carriers. His concept was revolutionary yet straightforward. Bombers would carry fighter planes, ferrying them into battle and unleashing them when needed. It was a bold solution to a dangerous problem, but convincing the Red Army was no small feat. At first, Vakhmistrov's idea was met with skepticism. The Soviet military prioritized sheer numbers over experimental projects, but Vakhmistrov wasn't one to back down. He argued that flying aircraft carriers could do much more than just escort bombers. They could conduct precision strikes, extend fighter ranges, and even intercept enemy bombers before they reached Soviet territory. Despite the resistance, his passion and persistence eventually earned him the green light to develop his vision. Vakhmistrov's dream took shape in the form of the Zveno project. He envisioned massive motherships carrying swarms of fighters. These airborne juggernauts could redefine air combat and even strike targets previously deemed unreachable. While his vision was grand, reality often stood in the way. Vakhmistrov faced countless technical challenges, military doubts, and even the slow-moving bureaucracy of the Red Army. But for him, failure was not an option. The Zveno project was a testament to Vakhmistrov's ingenuity and determination. Named after the Russian word for link, the project aimed to create a symbiotic relationship between bombers and fighters. The mighty TB-1 and TB-3 bombers were chosen as the carriers, while nimble fighters like the I-5 and later the I-16 were used for attack and escort roles. Designing the Zveno carriers wasn't easy. The fighters had to be attached without interfering with the bombers' control or aerodynamics. Since advanced wind tunnel testing wasn't available, engineers relied on trial and error. They experimented with mounting fighters above wings, below fuselages, and even in combination configurations. Remarkably, some setups allowed bombers to fly faster and higher than before, as the fighters ran their engines mid-flight, drawing fuel from the bombers' tanks. Launching the fighters was straightforward. Pilots detached when needed. However, redocking was another story. Later models incorporated a trapeze system for mid-air refueling and reattachment, but it required exceptional skill. Communication was critical, so the Zveno carriers use innovative systems like in-flight telephones and signal lights to ensure coordination. On the ground, challenges persisted. Loading fighters onto the bombers required dozens of mechanics, ground crew, and a lot of patience. The process was so strenuous that the arrival of a tractor to assist was celebrated like a national holiday. Despite these hurdles, Vakhmistrov continued refining the Zveno project. At its peak, the Zveno could carry up to 5 fighters. These parasite planes weren't just passengers. They could conduct precision strikes, defend their mothership, and even return for fueling. Although the project showed great promise, it struggled to gain full acceptance due to constant redesigns and the looming obsolescence of the TB-3 bomber. But for a brief moment, the Zveno was a marvel of engineering that pushed the boundaries of aerial warfare. The path from concept to reality was anything but smooth for the Zveno project. When Vladimir Vakhmistrov first proposed the idea in 1930, the Red Army showed interest but remained cautious. The initial design relied on the TB-1 bomber, but as newer aircraft like the more powerful 4-engine TB-3 emerged, Vakhmistrov had to redesign his prototypes repeatedly. Each new fighter model, from the I-5 to the I-16, also required modifications. It was an endless cycle of trial, error, and adaptation. By 1932, the Red Army tested the first Zveno configurations and saw potential in the concept. Fighters could be deployed mid-air to defend bombers or strike enemy targets, but technical issues and the high cost of production led to hesitation. The TB-3 bomber, though a marvel in its time, was rapidly becoming outdated compared to modern designs like the American B-17. With its lumbering speed and crude lines, it was ill-suited for a new era of warfare. Despite these challenges, in 1939, the Soviet military finally placed an order for 40 Zveno carriers. However, enthusiasm for the project began to wane as the geopolitical landscape shifted. By 1940, Nazi Germany had begun its conquest of Europe, and the Soviet Union's resources were redirected to proven weaponry. Only 5 Zveno carriers were built, and even those were dismantled and placed in storage as priorities changed. The outbreak of World War II thrust the Zveno project back into the spotlight. Faced with the Nazi invasion in June 1941, the Red Army desperately needed innovative strategies to counter Germany's rapid advances. The Zveno carriers, once relegated to obscurity, were quickly restored and put into action. While the Zveno was not the revolutionary weapon Vakhmistrov had envisioned, it proved to be a capable stopping-gap solution in the Soviet Union's time of need. When Nazi Germany launched its massive invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was caught off guard. As cities fell and defenses crumbled, Soviet commanders scrambled for innovative tactics to slow the Nazi advance. The Zveno carriers, long overlooked, were suddenly thrust into combat. Their first major test came during a mission to destroy an oil refinery deep behind the enemy lines. 4 I-16 fighters, heavily loaded with bombs, detached from their TB-3 carrier just 40 kilometers from the target. Enemy fighters didn't intercept them, mistaking the I-16s for friendly aircraft. After all, how could Soviet fighters have made it so far? The strike was devastating, catching the enemy completely off guard. Buoyed by this success, the Zveno carriers were tasked with a more ambitious mission, destroying the King Carol Bridge in Romania, a critical supply route for Nazi Allied forces. On August 10, 1941, 3 Zveno carriers launched, but mechanical issues forced one to turn back. The remaining fighters pressed on, braving intense anti-aircraft fire to bomb the bridge. Although damaged, the bridge remained standing. Undeterred, the mission was repeated 3 days later. This time, 6 fighters stuck the target, scoring 5 direct hits and destroying a vital section of the bridge. The Zveno carriers continued their campaign, launching surprise attacks on targets across Eastern Europe. On August 17th, they destroyed a dry dock in Constanta, crippling enemy naval operations. Later that month, they bombed crossings over the Dnieper River, slowing the Nazi advance significantly. Their agility and ability to strike unreachable targets made them a valuable asset in the early days of the war. On September 9, 1941, Zveno fighters achieved another milestone. 2 I-16s engaged and shot down a pair of German Bf-109 fighters. These missions proved the Zveno's combat viability, but they were also a testament to Soviet desperation. Ultimately, the Zveno project faded into obscurity as modern dive bombers and better trained crews became available. Yet, during its brief tenure, the Zveno carriers conducted over 30 successful missions, showcasing the integrity of Soviet engineers. While flawed and outdated, they left an undeniable mark on the history of aviation, proving that innovation often emerges in the direst of times. The Zveno project wasn't just an isolated experiment by the Soviet Union. It was a bold step in an ongoing global quest to solve one of aviation's biggest challenges, extending the operational range of aircraft. While the Zveno carriers were among the first to test the concept, the dream of airborne aircraft carriers persisted far beyond the 1930s and 1940s, inspiring experiments worldwide. The United States took a particular interest in the idea, albeit with a different approach. In the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. Navy experimented with massive airships like the USS Akron and USS Macon, which carried and launched small aircraft. These airborne aircraft carriers were envisioned as strategic tools to patrol vast oceans and provide reconnaissance. Though promising in theory, the program ended tragically due to crashes caused by weather and structural failures. Post-World War II, advances in aviation technology reignited interest in flying carriers. The Cold War's high-stakes competition between superpowers led to renewed efforts to push the boundaries of engineering. One of the most intriguing experiments was the U.S. Air Force's Falcon project in the 1950s. Under this program, massive B-36 bombers were outfitted to carry F-84 Thunderjet fighters beneath their fuselage. The fighters could detach for missions and return to the bomber using a trapeze-like docking system. However, the technical complexity and limited success of the docking system made the project short-lived. The Soviets, too, continued exploring airborne carriers during the Cold War. Concepts for giant aircraft, capable of carrying swarms of smaller planes, were sketched but never left the drawing board. The introduction of aerial refueling largely solved the problem of fighter range, making airborne carriers less of a priority. However, the fundamental idea remained appealing, particularly for long-range missions and rapid deployment. The concept gained new momentum in the 1960s when Lockheed proposed the CL-1201, a nuclear-powered airborne aircraft carrier that could stay aloft for weeks. This behemoth was designed to carry dozens of fighters, served as a mobile command center, and even launch reconnaissance drones. Though technologically ambitious, the project was ultimately deemed impractical due to its immense size, cost, and the risks associated with a nuclear reactor in the sky. In the 21st century, the legacy of flying aircraft carriers has evolved into unmanned and autonomous systems. Modern aircraft carriers like the USS Gerald R. Ford showcase cutting-edge technologies, but on the horizon are concepts involving drone motherships. Swarms of drones, launched and controlled from large platforms, could mimic the Zveno's mission in modern warfare, striking targets deep in enemy territory while minimizing human risk. Flying aircraft carriers remain an enduring symbol of ingenuity, blending ambition with the limits of technology. While none of these projects have achieved the scale of permanence envisioned by pioneers like Vakhmistrov, they have inspired decades of innovation and redefined what's possible in aviation. The Zveno project may have been ahead of its time, but its spirit lives on in every experiment that dares to ask, what if we could take the skies one step further? The Zveno carriers might not have reshaped warfare as their creators dreamed, but they prove the power of innovation under pressure. Their legacy lives on in modern aviation concepts and the relentless pursuit of solving impossible problems. From Soviet bombers to futuristic drone swarms, the idea of flying aircraft carriers continues to push the boundaries of what's possible in the skies. Because history shows us one thing: bold ideas may not always succeed, but they always inspire.